Welcome. My name is Craig Svensson, and I'm delighted to have you back for the second session of the Faith Community Institute class that's entitled Help for Those Living with Chronic Illness and Pain. The goal of this course is to help provide practical and biblical help to individuals who are living with the pain and suffering that comes with chronic illness. In addition, I'm hopeful that we'll be able to provide some tools to equip people who are not living with chronic illness how to best minister to people who are, whether they be in your family, in your church, or in your workplace. Last time, we began an overview of chronic illness and pain. And I talked about the frequency of chronic illness and gave you some insight into that and a little bit about the experience of what chronic illness means. And then talked specifically about pain and why it's so important to recognize pain as an entity in itself, how it differs from acute pain, and how it can impact an individual's life. The objective for this second class is threefold. First, I'd like to address the question, how does chronic illness differ from acute illness? And I'll talk a little bit about why it's important to recognize those differences. And then second, I want to answer the question, what are the challenges of living with chronic illness and pain? How does that challenge our life as an individual living with chronic illness or as someone who lives with a person that has chronic illness? And then the third objective is to help you recognize the dangerous ditches on the path of life that people who live with chronic illness and pain can fall into. Because not falling into them begins by first recognizing that they're there, and then a strategy to be certain that you don't succumb to them. A key to understanding chronic illness is to recognize that it is very different than acute illness. The challenge is that most people have only experienced acute illness. They have had an infection or an injury. Their body heals and things are back to normal. There may have been a pause in life for a little bit of time, but everything gets back to normal then. A common misunderstanding comes when people take that personal experience of acute illness and export it into the life of those who are experiencing a chronic illness and assume that the experiences translate, but they don't. This chart is actually an attempt to try to show a number of different ways in which acute and chronic illnesses differ from one another. This shows the categories that I'd like to talk about. First of all, onset. The onset of illness for an acute illness is generally very quick. It's rapid. And that contrasts with chronic illness, which often is gradual. And it's not a linear rise necessarily either. It can wax and wane over time, perhaps progressively getting more and more apparent that something is going on. But it may take years before it fully develops into something that can be identified as a specific disease. That's very different than acute illness. The duration is often very different. Acute illnesses generally have a limited duration, whereas chronic illness is indefinite. It may be something that stays with you for the rest of your life. It may last months, it may last years, it may last decades. The cause of an acute illness is usually singular. There is an organism that is causing it, the upper respiratory tract infection. There's a specific injury event that occurs. In contrast, there are often multiple causes for chronic illness, and sometimes those causes are unknown. The diagnosis for acute illnesses tends to be quite accurate. On the other hand, the diagnosis for chronic illness can be very difficult, particularly differentiating several similar chronic illnesses. And we're going to talk about that pretty extensively in an upcoming session. The prognosis, in other words, what will happen, is also different between acute illness and chronic illness. The prognosis for Acute illnesses is often pretty precise. We know how long it's going to last. We know how quickly treatment will be effective. On the other hand, for chronic illnesses, the prognosis is often unknown. We don't know how quickly it will progress. We don't know how it will manifest itself specifically in a given individual. The treatments for acute illnesses tend to be effective. Those for chronic illnesses are often marginal. Sometimes they have very little impact on the disease. So these are very different experiences for patients, acute versus chronic illness. What's especially important, though, to recognize is that a key difference is that an acute illness threatens your health, but a chronic illness threatens yourself. When you have an acute illness, it's going to get better. You'll get back to work. You'll get back to your activities. You'll get back to feeling good again. You'll get your strength back. Things will be normal once again. And so it might be a pause in your life, but it's not a major change in your life. Chronic illness is very different. Chronic illness may change your life for the rest of your life. Things that were important to you, you may not be able to do anymore. Things that you enjoyed, you may not be able to experience the joy of anymore. And so often what happens with chronic illness, the threat is not greatest in your body, but rather in yourself. Or to express it another way, the locus of suffering is different for acute and chronic illness. In an acute illness, the locus of suffering is your body. Something is wrong with my body. In chronic illness, it shifts from the body to the person as the primary source of suffering. I'm not suggesting there aren't problems with the body, there aren't pains that arise from the body, but it's that suffering in your personhood, often even your identity, because you can no longer do the things you once did as a spouse, as a parent, as an employee, and now your personhood is threatened. And that's so much deeper than this, the challenge of a body that isn't working quite right. In this slide, what I attempt to provide is a summary of the experience of the challenges that are faced by patients that are living with chronic illness. And I'm going to use as the example patients that are living with a degenerative disease, a disease for which there's no cure, a disease that is only going to get worse in time, which means a disease that will only impact your life more. And what I want to do is walk through this wheel of experience of a patient that is living with a chronic degenerative disease. And it begins, first of all, with facing the reality of diagnostic uncertainty. What you'll find is that people who are diagnosed with degenerative diseases have gone through a meaningful period of time where no one knew what was wrong with them. They began developing nondescript symptoms that over time waxed and waned a bit, but got progressively worse and more impactful for their life. Very commonly with degenerative diseases, it takes a significant period of time for symptoms to emerge with enough consistency and impairment in order for someone to meet the criteria of being labeled as having a certain disease. So what this means is that the person, by the time they receive a diagnosis, has often gone through even years of not knowing what is wrong with them and not being able to find somebody that could tell them what was wrong with them. And one of the things that happens is during this emerging period of symptoms growing and manifesting, strange sensations in their bodies, etc., they get referred to people, specialists, to try to figure out what's wrong. And so they go to many different clinicians. And sometimes those clinicians have different ideas about what might be going on. And early on, they may have a label put on them that subsequent symptoms suggest, no, that's not right. That's not the disease they have. They actually have this. And so they'll go through periods of misdiagnosis. And so you have people that walk through a period of time of diagnostic uncertainty. This is hard to live with, where you've got emerging symptoms that are increasingly troubling and no one's really sure what's wrong with you. But it also creates suspicion on the part of family members. Well, I don't know what's wrong with her. She keeps going to a bunch of different doctors and they all have different ideas. I think it's all in her head. I don't know what's going on. Right? You get the picture. Because no one's certain what's going on, some people are certain nothing is going on. It's really all in your head. And that's a troubling period of time to live through. And it can be time consuming because you have all these visits, all these tests, people trying to figure out what's wrong with you. And then once you actually get a clear diagnosis, then there's prognostic uncertainty. No one can tell you exactly how the disease is going to progress in you as an individual. No one knows how quickly it will degenerate in terms of decreasing your mobility, other parts of your body that will be influenced. No one can give you that with certainty. And so what you know is you have a ticking time bomb within you, but you don't know when it's going to go off or how often it's going to go off. And it's not surprising then that sometimes people respond to that with fear, with anxiety, and some people can even fall into despair because they know they're not going to get better and life could get dramatically worse for them. People often face the challenge of treatment dilemmas. For many of these diseases, there really is no good treatment. There might be some options out there. And the challenge is many of these diseases are treated by drugs that have the potential for serious adverse effects. And so people face what we call decisional conflict. Decisional conflict is when I'm faced with a decision, and no matter what I decide, I could have a bad outcome. So, for example, if you have a disease that's immune-oriented, if you don't do anything, your disease could get worse. In fact, probably will. If you take this drug, on the other hand, it might slow that progression down. But it's also, in a small number of patients, associated with a real nasty side effect that could actually be worse than the disease itself. So now you're faced with a dilemma. What do? If I do nothing, my health could get worse. If I take this medication, my health could get worse. What do? We call that decisional conflict. That's a very difficult state of being. And it's very hard to make some of these decisions when you know either choice could result in a bad outcome. It's also true that many times people are facing therapies that could be very expensive. And you're faced with this challenge. All right, this drug only helps a very small portion of people, but it's going to take a large part of my income. What we thought we were going to do on vacations, what we thought we were going to do on holidays, what we thought we were going to do in retirement would change if we spend this much money on a therapy, and yet it might not help me. Do I invest the money? Do I do it? That's very hard to decide. And then patients will generally face fluctuating symptoms. Whether the person has something like Parkinson's disease or multiple sclerosis or arthritis, there'll be changes. There'll be weeks where they feel pretty good, weeks where they don't feel good at all, and what they can do and can't do varies with time. They have to learn how to listen to their body. They have to learn what things to avoid because they're certain it'll provoke worse symptoms. They have to learn when they can push themselves to do something that, yes, I might get a little bit worse, but it's worth it. They have to try to time things when they're going to be feeling best, and that creates a tremendous amount of challenges in their life. And not only do they face fluctuating symptoms, but because of that, people will question the validity of their ailment, and if not the validity of their ailment, people will question just how sick are you? Because last week you really did a lot of stuff, and now this week you're telling me you can't even go out to the store and run the normal errands. And people are questioned about the validity of their illness. People think it's in your mind. You're not really sick, or you're exaggerating how bad you're feeling because you're trying to avoid something, a responsibility or something that you don't want to do. And that just only adds to a person's experience of suffering when those who are important to them in life begin to question the validity of their ailment and the severity of that ailment. And ultimately, it may result in some pretty significant life adjustments. There are personal things that can happen, things that you you once enjoyed that you can't do anymore. I used to, for example, rollerblade was my form of exercise. I'd come home from the university and throw my rollerblades on and go up to a track near our home and just rollerblade for a couple miles around there. And I enjoyed that as a form of activity. But when I injured my back, one of the things they told me not to do anymore is don't rollerblade anymore. So a form of activity that I enjoyed that was good for my health was out the window. And many people who have chronic ailments have experienced that. It can impact relationships that are important to you. Your marriage, there may be things that you enjoyed doing together that you can't do anymore. When I injured my back, I could no longer ride a bike. We couldn't, as a family, take the kids, my wife and I, and all go out on a bike ride anymore because I simply could not sit on a bike any longer. Things change in life as a result of a chronic ailment. And there are many examples I'm sure those of you who are listening could give. And sometimes it could have a huge professional impact on your life. I recently heard a young woman who she decided she wanted to be a graphic artist. And so she went to college for that purpose. And I think it was at the end of her sophomore year that she actually launched her own company. And it took off like gangbusters. She had so much work, it was actually became difficult for her to complete her studies because her business was going so well. But shortly before she graduated, she woke up one morning and she had a numbness all down one of her arms. And soon that numbness was exhibited in the other arm as well. And very soon she was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. Her ability to do the work of a graphic artist was over. Her dream of a career was done. Her company that had started off like gangbusters was now turned on its head. And she was only 23 years old. The impact of a degenerative disease on someone's life can be dramatic. And those impacts are not just in your personal life, your relational life, and your professional life. They obviously really attack you on the inside. And they can become a very big heart challenge, living with the dramatic changes that have to come in life as a result of a degenerative disease. So suffice it to say, chronic illness and pain can dramatically alter people's life's experience. And yet at the same time, most of that suffering goes unseen. Most people with whom they live life don't even realize what they're experiencing. And it's important for people who are living with chronic illness to realize that there are ditches on the path of living with a chronic illness that you can very easily fall into. And this is just my effort to try to illustrate that. On one side of the road is obsession. It is very easy to become obsessed with your chronic illness. All you can think about, all you talk about is your chronic illness. You spend all your time learning about it. You hang around only with other people that have that same illness. You go to meetings about that illness. And what can happen if you become obsessive is that you drive other people away. On the other hand, there's a ditch on the other side of the road, the other extreme. You can surrender to it. You can become apathetic, not try to push yourself, and just surrender yourself to whatever limitations the disease suggests you have to make in life. Neither ditch will serve us well. And the reality is, as people go through life living with a chronic illness, they can move from one ditch to the other. And it's important to recognize that these ditches exist and to know how to make sure we don't fall into them. And if we do, how we get out of them. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in a future session. But first off, it's important to recognize that there are ways that we can navigate living life with chronic illness. And let me just suggest to you a couple. First of all, it takes intentionality. You have to have an intentional approach when you are diagnosed with an incurable ailment that is going to stay with you and that's going to impact your life. What that means is you have to have a purposeful response to your illness. Think about it, plan, don't obsess about it, but yet recognize and think through the types of changes that it might produce in your life and prepare yourself for them as much as you can. Secondly, it's going to require some honest self-reflection. And what that means is a willingness to examine your own heart. It is impactful to have somebody put a label on you that means you have an incurable ailment and things are going to get worse. It simply is. And you have to be willing to look at your own heart and see how you're handling that, how you're responding to that. How are we responding to that such that it overflows into the lives of those who are important to you, your family members, your friends, your coworkers. And you need to be willing to do this periodically. How is my heart doing? Is it well with my soul? What am I manifesting in my life that really is a reflection of my chronic illness? And we'll devote 2 good sessions to focusing on some of these issues. It also involves navigating life with chronic illness. It involves open communication. You've got to have good communication with your family first and foremost. Those are the most important relationships. People need to be willing to discuss openly and honestly. You have to be willing to share those things with your family, but they have to be willing to and able to share things with you, to talk about how your mood is impacting them so that you understand how your response is influencing their experience in life. You have to be willing to talk to them about the kind of adjustments you think you need to make in life and help them work with you through those adjustments because it's going to impact their life as well. And you need to come to a common mind of how we're going to respond to this life that now has a chronic illness as a part of it. It takes wisdom and discernment. There's lots of decisions that have to be made constantly when you're living with a chronic illness, and you need wisdom and discerning. And what that means is you need to be praying about how to handle your illness. It's very easy to allow your prayers to be focused on simply help me feel good, take this away, help this treatment work, and all of those things are appropriate objects of our prayer. But our prayer has to go deeper than that. It has to go to the heart issues that often arise when living with chronic illness and living with chronic pain. And we need to pray about those heart issues, that the Lord would help us respond to our experiences well, to demonstrate steadfastness in our faith in the midst of the physical challenges that we are experiencing. And finally, most importantly, it requires an eternal perspective. Whatever suffering we have in this life is nothing compared to the glory that shall be ours in Christ Jesus. Isn't that true? And it's very important that we not lose that perspective, that we're pilgrims on this soil. We're just passing through. Whatever we experience in this life is temporary, and sometimes what we experience is hard. And there may be days that we are holding on by our fingernails, but it's temporary, and it's nothing compared to the glory that will be ours in Jesus Christ. And we need to keep that in perspective, because that will give us strength. That will give us hope in the most difficult of days. This last slide lists a number of resources that you might find helpful that give you broad perspectives about living with chronic illness. And I want to take a few moments to touch on these. These are listed in the handout if you download the PDF from the site as well as this presentation. The first is Chronic Joy, which is a chronic illness ministry, and I've got the URL there. There's lots of great resources on their website. They have blogs that I think you would find challenging, helpful, encouraging, inspiring, written by various people that either are living with chronic illness, and that's the most case, and perhaps others who are ministering to people with chronic illness. They also have some Bible studies available. For example, they have a great Bible study that husbands and wives can do. So when you have a spouse that is living with a chronic illness, that puts a challenge to marriage, right? And marriage is challenging. You've got two sinners together trying to live together. Now you add chronic illness to that, and the challenge is added. And they've got a great Bible study that's designed specifically for couples to work through to help them in that journey, and many other helpful resources, including some resources that you can give to other people to help them understand the true nature of chronic illness. Many of you are familiar with Joni Eareckson Tada. Joni Eareckson Tada experienced a traumatic injury, both dramatic and traumatic, in her late teen years, and has been a quadriplegic in a wheelchair for over 50 years. She has a ministry that is mostly to people with serious disabilities, but a lot of great resources also on their website there. And then let me point you to 4 books for those of you who might want further reading. Tim Keller's book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering, might be the most accessible, comprehensive look at suffering from a theological and from a biblical point of view. Very, very accessible read, though. C.S. Lewis, The Problem of Pain. I don't think anyone has wrestled with these difficult questions more than C.S. Lewis. I will say, for those of you who are familiar with his book, Mere Christianity, this is on a different level. This is a much more difficult book to work through. It's not something that you want to hand, for example, to a new believer, I don't think. It's a pretty deep walk going through the book, but it's a good one. Kelly Kapic has written an interesting book, Embodied Hope. It's a series of meditations on pain and on suffering. Some of it comes from his own experiences. It's a very thoughtful reflection that helps dispel some common misconceptions about God and about suffering. I have known a couple of people who live with chronic illness who have said this has been the most helpful book to them. It's been the most inspiring for them to think about biblically their experiences of suffering. And then at the end, I just lift my book there, which is really, it's not a book that is directed specifically at Christians. It's a broad book. It's written to a general audience about how to navigate life while living with pain and suffering. And then at the end, I include my testimony of my Christian faith and how that has impacted my response to chronic illness. I would certainly encourage you to any of these resources because I think they could help you in your journey either through chronic illness or in your journey to help others. Well, these 2 sessions, I trust, have given a pretty good overview about chronic illness and some of the experiences. In the next session, Lord willing, we're going to begin looking at some of the difficult medical questions that people who are living with chronic illness must face. And I hope you'll find it to be very practical and helpful in your own journey. Let me close our time here today in prayer. Father, we do thank you for this time that we've had. I thank you for those who are listening and pray above all, Father, that they will be reminded that you journey with them, that however difficult, however challenging, however painful, however dramatic their experience in chronic illness might be, that you are with them. You will never leave them. You will never forsake them. And Father, that they will know that they have a God in heaven who loves them and cares for them, to whom they can always turn, and that they can come to your throne and find grace to help in their time of need. Father, indeed, may you always be the first and the constant one to whom we turn to find our help. And we're grateful that the throne room is open because of what Jesus has done. And it's in his precious name that I pray. Amen.